They forced me to clean the floor on my knees at dinner. I stood on the table instead. That's not a metaphor. That's not me being dramatic. That is exactly what happened, and I will never forget the way the soup steam fogged up my glasses while I wiped up after their spilled lentils with the sleeve of my own cardigan, the cardigan I had worn every winter since before Carla married my son, and decided that beige meant inferior. I'm 76 now. I live alone in a flat above a laundromat where the walls are thin and the heater coughs like an old dog, but it is mine. I pay rent from a small pension, and the rest from cleaning an office twice a week, which is rather ironic, I suppose. The difference is that I clean floors now by choice. Back then, I was told to do it as though it were my privilege, and the moment I said no, I was treated as though I had broken some sacred family pact. It didn't begin with the floor. It began with my hip. One wrong step on a wet curb outside the pharmacy, and suddenly I was in hospital, immobilized, confused, and signing forms I could barely read. Daniel flew in 2 days later, bustling with concern, talking to nurses like he was their superior, never quite meeting my eyes. "You can't stay in that old cottage alone anymore, Mum," he said, holding my hand as if I were already gone. I loved that cottage. I had spent my entire married life there, had painted its walls after Derek died, planted the roses by the side gate, even had the gutters redone with my own money after the council's half-hearted inspection. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to argue. Not then. Not when they were putting metal into my bones. Not when I could barely lift my legs without wincing. So I nodded and agreed to stay, just for a while, in their new house until I recovered, until I found somewhere smaller. Just a few weeks, I thought. A month at most. Daniel promised to help me look for new housing. He kissed my forehead in the hospital, and I believed that meant something. They sent a van for my things. Not all of them, just the basics, they said. Essentials. Carla coordinated it with a clipboard and a Bluetooth headset, walking through my life like a museum curator selecting which relics to save. My photo albums were digitized later, my books too heavy for the guest room shelves. Only one suitcase came with me, and even then, Carla made a face at the scuffs on the zipper. She bought me a new toothbrush, arranged my medications into color-coded containers, and placed my clothes in the wardrobe of the guest room they had repainted in something called almond blush. I had no chair in that room, nowhere to sit but the edge of the bed or a small plastic stool in the corner. The closet door didn't close properly, and there was no lock. I remember staring at the small sign on the wall above the mirror. Gratitude turns what we have into enough, and thinking, I didn't ask for any of this. The first week was quiet. They insisted I rest, brought me tea, arranged appointments with a physiotherapist who came to the house and called me sweetheart, with a tone I didn't like. I wasn't sweet. I was recovering. I was surviving. And I didn't like the way the house echoed with a kind of silence that wasn't peace, but absence. The children, Carla's from her first marriage, never spoke to me unless prompted. Daniel worked late. Carla managed everything with the efficiency of a woman running a retreat she didn't want to host. Meals were scheduled, seats assigned, TV volume low. I was asked not to use the washer without permission, as the system is delicate. I overheard her once on the phone telling someone, "It's just a bit chaotic with her here." Like hosting a guest who never leaves, I was in the hallway. She knew I could hear. They didn't make me work, not right away, but they didn't invite me either, to conversations, to choices, to the daily life of the home. I was a shadow drifting between kitchen and guest room. I offered to cook, but Carla said no. We're on a strict routine with the kids. I suggested baking, and she said gluten-free only. I folded laundry once, trying to be helpful. She refolded it. Quietly, with a sigh. The first time they asked me to sweep after dinner, it was framed as a favor. Just the dining room, Mum, while we get the kids ready for bed. I did it gladly. Gratitude, I told myself. This is what gratitude looks like. The next night, it was the counters, then the plates, then the floor, always the floor. By week 3, I no longer sat at the table for meals. I served myself last. They didn't say I had to. It just became easier that way. Carla needed space to arrange the plates. Daniel's place had to be near the window. The children sat with headphones on. I ate standing sometimes, and I wiped crumbs as I went, like a dog grateful for scraps. It was during a dinner party, a casual Friday with Daniel's boss and his wife, that the real humiliation arrived. I remember the smell of roasted garlic, the low clink of wine glasses, and the soft music playing through the speakers in the ceiling. Carla wore pearls. Daniel had polished shoes. I wore a cardigan with a loose button and sensible shoes because I had no other options. Someone spilled wine. It splattered across the polished wooden floor, red and sudden. Carla laughed and looked at me. Oh, dear. Mum, would you mind? Her voice was soft, honeyed, almost gentle. But it was not a request. I knelt slowly because my hip still ached, and I wiped. The rag was thin. The wine clung to the grain of the wood. Daniel didn't look at me. The boss made a joke, something about hiring out my services. The wife chuckled, and my grandson, 12 and smug with a private school's false confidence, said, "Grandma's the maid now." I laughed too, quietly, just to keep the peace. My knees burned. My pride burned more. And I stayed there longer than necessary, just to keep my hands busy so I wouldn't say something I couldn't unsay. The silence was too thick to rise through. Later that night, in my room, I counted the bruises on my knees. 7 small purple blossoms. I pressed one just to feel it. I stared at my suitcase in the corner and realized I could pack it in under 5 minutes. I wouldn't even need help. I didn't sleep. I watched the wall until the shadows shifted, and that was when I remembered the table. Not their table. Not the polished one that smelled like lemon oil and disapproval. My table, decades ago, in a school auditorium. I had stood on it once at 31, leading a protest after budget cuts threatened to eliminate the arts program. I had raised my voice then. I had pointed at the superintendent and said, "You will not erase us quietly." I had been applauded. I had been fierce. Somewhere between then and now, I had stopped standing on tables. I had allowed myself to be folded small, made convenient. I had mistaken silence for grace. But that night, sitting on the edge of a guest bed in a house half mine but never home, I knew the silence had to end. Not with screaming, not with slammed doors, but with a gesture they wouldn't forget. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I wanted dignity, and I would take it back with my own 2 hands. The next morning began like all the others, with the careful rattle of dishes in the kitchen, the sound of Carla's slippers gliding across the tile, and the soft hum of Daniel's voice taking a conference call from his study. I stayed in my room longer than usual, sitting on the edge of the bed in the cardigan I hadn't washed because the laundry machine was password protected. Yes, a digital lock for a washer. and the password was sensitive information that Carla claimed was better kept centralized, whatever that meant. I listened through the thin door as the children argued over tablet chargers and someone dropped a spoon. I waited for the tap, tap, tap of Carla's nails on her phone screen before opening the door and moving silently toward the kitchen, hoping to slip in, pour a cup of coffee, and slip out again. But that morning, something small had changed. On the kitchen island beside the coffee maker was a white laminated list. Tasks for the week. My name was on it. Not handwritten, but typed and printed in bullet points under the heading, Mum's Contribution, like I was a department in need of coordination. Monday, breakfast dishes. Tuesday, sweep dining room. Wednesday, clean baseboards in hall. Thursday, vacuum guest room and wipe windows. Friday, dinner service. No explanation, no invitation for feedback, just a list. I stared at it for a long moment, not touching it, not reacting. The ink glared back at me. That was when Carla breezed in, dressed in something soft and pastel, eyes bright with that particular frozen cheerfulness that feels like a slap. "Oh, good. You saw the schedule," she said, voice light, too light, the way you talk to someone you don't respect but can't afford to offend. I thought it might be helpful to have a bit more structure around the house. Just so we're all, aligned, I wanted to say something. Anything. But the words sat bitter and heavy in my throat, and I just nodded, because that's what I had been doing for years, nodding, accommodating, adjusting. She poured herself a smoothie, the blender roaring to life, and over the noise she added, "It's good for your mobility, really. Movement is medicine, right?" I stood there, mug in hand, thinking about the time I cleaned her kitchen before she gave birth to her second child, the time I stayed up all night sewing a hem on her maternity dress when she panicked before her baby. Shower, the money I gave them for their wedding, never repaid, never acknowledged. Movement is medicine. What a convenient phrase for someone who wanted me useful but invisible. I took my coffee to the dining table. Daniel walked in a few minutes later, tying his tie, nodding in my direction like I was the help. "Morning, Mum," he said without warmth. "Try not to use the front bathroom today." "We've got someone coming to regrout the tiles," I looked up. "I thought that was tomorrow." He shrugged. "Plans change. We've got a lot going on." Then he turned to Carla, kissed her cheek, whispered something I wasn't meant to hear, and left. I stared at the place he'd been standing, the space where a son should have been, and all I saw was an empty suit. That afternoon, I did as the list instructed. I swept. I wiped. I even vacuumed the corners of my own room, although I knew Carla would redo it with that cordless Dyson of hers, and then tell me gently that she was just getting the bits I couldn't see. I followed instructions, but inside, something had shifted. Not a full break, not yet, but the first hairline fracture in a structure long overdue for collapse. And it was later that evening, during dinner, when that fracture cracked wide open. It was a Tuesday, spaghetti night. Carla made zucchini noodles and turkey meatballs and served them on square white plates with the smugness of someone who believed her food choices elevated her morally. The children were sulking because she'd hidden the real pasta. Daniel was tired. I was seated barely at the far end of the table next to the baby's high chair, and across from the dishwasher I wasn't allowed to touch. Conversation was stiff, centered around real estate prices and Daniel's promotion. Carla spoke about an article she'd read on cognitive decline in the elderly. I wasn't named, but I might as well have been printed on the page. I focused on my plate, cutting the soft meatball into small pieces, even though no one cared how I ate. Halfway through the meal, the baby knocked over her sippy cup. It landed with a soft thud and then rolled, leaking water in a lazy arc across the floor toward my feet. Carla paused, sighed like a sitcom mother, and looked at me. "Mom, could you just—" No, please. No apology. Just the assumption that this was mine to fix. I didn't move. For the first time in weeks, I didn't obey. I sat still, fork in hand, eyes steady. Carla blinked, startled by the pause. "The water," she said again, pointing with her chin. I looked at Daniel. He didn't meet my gaze, just kept chewing. So I pushed back from the table, slow and steady, walked to the sink, took the cloth, thin, sour-smelling, and knelt. Again. The water was cold against my palm, and the floor had a sticky spot near the baseboard. I wiped it all, not just the spill, the entire area under the table. I scrubbed in silence while they ate, while they laughed at a joke about someone at Daniel's work, while Carla refilled wine glasses and offered more salad. I cleaned until the floor was spotless, and then I stayed down just a moment longer because something in me needed to memorize it. This feeling, this humiliation, this quiet, public stripping of self. Later that night, after the children had gone upstairs and the dishwasher had hummed to life, Carla approached me in the kitchen. "Mom, I just want you to know how grateful we are," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder as though I were a rescued stray. "You've been so helpful around here." "Really?" "I don't know how we'd manage without you." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because it was easier than responding. Then she added, "And I think the kids are really learning from your example. It's important they see older generations staying active." That word again, active. Not seen, not valued, just active, like a wind-up toy. I said goodnight and went to my room, turned the lock I had secretly installed when no one was home, and sat in the dark. The suitcase was still there. I opened it. Inside, the deed to my cottage, my birth certificate, my bank card, a small envelope of cash I had set aside for emergencies. I stared at it all and realized that the only thing left of my life was paper, and silence. And I thought, if they wanted a servant, they could hire one. If they wanted an invisible woman, they should have found a ghost. Because I was still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing where I knelt and where I stood. The next few days passed in the kind of hush that settles over a house when something real has happened, but no one dares name it. No one mentioned the kneeling. No one commented on the way I'd scrubbed the floor in front of company like a woman being punished. Not Daniel, who spent most of his time behind closed doors on business calls, emerging only for meals or to sigh at the children's half-finished homework. Not Carla, who resumed her clipped, sugary efficiency, bustling around with to-do lists and almond milk and reminders about curbside recycling. Even the children seemed quieter, like they had sensed a shift but weren't sure what to do with it. I waited, half expecting an apology, a moment of reflection, some recognition of what they'd turned me into. But none came. Instead, the list on the fridge was updated. More items now, still under my name, still typed. Saturday, organize kitchen drawers. Sunday, clean patio chairs. The font was bold, the tone officious, and my body, still bruised from kneeling, moved slower than before. I did what they asked, but I stopped doing anything else. I stopped offering help. I stopped smiling during breakfast. I stopped asking about their schedules or complimenting Carla's new dress, or pretending I hadn't heard the sarcasm in her voice when she described my little contributions. I became efficient, invisible, exact. I carried out my tasks with the precision of a housekeeper who no longer hoped for a raise or a thank you. If I was to be service, I would at least be quiet service. It was my form of resistance, small and petty, and entirely mine. One evening, Carla had her book club over. 3 women in scarves and Pilates leggings who arrived bearing kale chips and compliments about the house. I was instructed to stay upstairs just for a bit because the baby was asleep and Carla didn't want extra noise. I nodded, went to my room, and closed the door. From upstairs, I could hear their voices, high and chirpy, their laughter like wind chimes caught in a storm. They talked about overbearing mothers, about boundary setting, about aging with grace. I lay on my bed, listening to them dissect women like me, women they hadn't met but thought they understood. Needy, manipulative, outdated. I wondered if Carla had told them about me, about how I insisted on staying, about how I made things harder, about how I struggled to adjust. I imagined them nodding, validating her discomfort, framing my presence as a generational burden. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling, my hands folded neatly on my stomach, and imagined walking out mid-discussion, descending the stairs with perfect posture, standing in their sacred living room with its curated art and candle warmers, and asking softly if any of them had ever cleaned the floor on their knees while their grandson laughed. But I didn't move. I stayed in the room. I listened. I memorized. The next morning, the house was cold. Carla was out early for a Pilates class. Daniel had already left for work. The children were still in bed. I stood in the kitchen in my robe, waiting for the kettle to boil, and looked again at the list. This time, I took it off the fridge, folded it once, and placed it in the trash. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't slam the bin lid. I simply removed the order from sight, like one erases a mistaken pencil. That afternoon, Carla noticed, she didn't ask. She just printed another copy and taped it to the inside of the pantry door. This one had stars next to the priority items. It felt absurd, childish, patronizing. I almost laughed, but I didn't. Because there was nothing funny about being managed like a liability in a house you helped pay for. It was on Thursday afternoon that I found the envelope. It had been slipped under the door of my room, unmarked, pale blue. Inside was a gift card for a salon and a printed note. Thought you might like a little refresh, our treat. Hair, maybe a facial? Just something to help you feel like yourself again. Love, Carla. No signature from Daniel, just her. I held the card in my hand for a long time, unsure whether to scream or shred it. Was it kindness? Pity? A bribe? Did she want to fix me or erase me? I thought of my gray roots, the lines on my face, the softness under my arms. I thought of the years I had spent earning those marks, surviving with them, through widowhood and disappointment and the quiet erosion of respect. And now she wanted to refresh me, as if I were an old web page, as if I could be updated into something more palatable. I placed the card back in the envelope and tucked it into my suitcase, beside the deed, beside the envelope of cash, another artifact for the file I was building, the file of who I was when I finally left. The small things became unbearable. The way Daniel corrected my stories at dinner, as though his version mattered more. The way Carla would rearrange my folded laundry, muttering about standards. The way my place at the table subtly moved closer to the kitchen each night. I was shrinking, centimeter by centimeter, until I was barely visible. I had dreams, vivid ones, where I was trapped in the pantry, or behind the washing machine, or in a drawer. I'd wake up gasping, only to find myself in that almond blush room with no chair, no mirror, no self. I stopped speaking, unless spoken to. I stopped making tea for anyone but myself. And even that felt like rebellion. Then one evening, Daniel's boss came for dinner again, this time with his wife and their teenage son. I was told to dress nicely. Carla laid out a beige sweater for me. I put it back in the drawer and wore my navy blouse, the one with the tiny buttons and the faint smell of mothballs. I did not offer to cook. I did not help set the table. I sat quietly, placed at the end like a decorative item from a time no one remembered, but didn't dare throw away. The conversation danced around startups, property values, school rankings. I was asked 2 questions the entire evening about my hip and whether I still read those paperback mystery novels. I answered briefly, politely. Then the wine spilled, not by accident. Carla was reaching for the salt and bumped her glass, a small mess, easily handled. She looked at me, smiled. "Mum, do you mind?" Her tone was sweet, too sweet. Saccharine enough to rot teeth. I didn't move. She held the smile a beat longer, then turned back to her guests. "She's such a help around the house," she said lightly. "We're really lucky. Not everyone's mother-in-law is so graceful." That word again. I stood slowly, not because I was willing, but because I wanted to see what they would do if I did. I walked to the kitchen, took the cloth, and wiped the spill without kneeling. I stood tall. I did it with my head high. When I returned to my seat, Daniel gave me a look. Not angry, embarrassed, as if I had done something shameful by asserting the smallest shred of dignity. I smiled at him, the way I used to when he lied about his homework as a child. Patient, disappointed, resolute. That night, I didn't sleep. I wrote a list of my own. Bus lines, room listings, the names of women I used to know. I wasn't planning yet, but I was preparing, and they didn't even notice. They never do. Not until you're gone. It was raining the morning I decided to walk, not because I had anywhere to be or because I particularly liked the rain, my hip still twinged when the weather turned, but because I needed to see the world outside their windows. Their house was pristine, sealed, airtight in the way museums are, beautiful, controlled, and utterly lifeless. I needed air that hadn't been filtered through Carla's citrus diffusers or Daniel's cautious small talk. I needed noise that didn't belong to a television set programmed to ambient jazz. So I pulled on my oldest shoes, the ones I wasn't supposed to wear inside because they tracked grit, and zipped up my coat, the one they said made me look tired, and I walked down their winding cul-de-sac, where every house looked like a clone of the next, past the manicured lawns that smelled faintly of chemicals and quiet competition, past the ornamental mailboxes and curated porch chairs, until the neighborhood softened into something less performative. A row of older houses appeared, cracked paint, flower beds blooming without symmetry. There was life here. Real, unfiltered, imperfect life. I walked slowly, testing my step against the damp pavement, and somewhere between the corner deli and the library, I saw a sign in a window. Room for rent. Small but warm. For quiet woman. No nonsense. No drama. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sign through the foggy glass. My reflection stared back. Soft face, tired eyes, hair pinned up with the same clip I'd used for years. I looked like someone who was almost invisible, but almost was not quite. And not quite was still something. I wrote the number down on the back of a pharmacy receipt and tucked it into my wallet. I didn't call. Not yet. Just having the number made the day feel different. It was a thread, a potential crack in the wall that had surrounded me for too long. I walked back slowly, stopping for tea at a small cafe, where no one knew me and no one cared that I sat alone. I read the headlines on an abandoned newspaper and watched the rain beat on the window until the world felt less flat. When I returned, Carla asked if I'd gotten lost. Daniel made a joke about GPS. I smiled politely, lied about browsing shops, and handed Carla the raisin bun I'd bought as a peace offering. She took it, then peeled it apart with a fork as though checking for allergens. That night, I took out the slip of paper with the phone number. I unfolded it, smoothed it flat. I stared at the ink until I could recite the number from memory. Then I folded it again and slid it into the same envelope as my cash and deed and bank card. My escape file. My proof of agency. The next morning, Carla asked if I'd consider watching the baby for a few hours so she could attend a wellness workshop. She phrased it as though it were optional, but her hands were already on the keys, her hair already tied back, her yoga mat visible in the back seat of her car. I nodded, of course. I wasn't heartless. I cradled the baby, soothed her to sleep, sang old lullabies that had no place in this modern, gluten-free house. The baby clutched my necklace, the one Daniel gave me before his first dance recital, back when he needed me and wasn't ashamed of that fact. Holding that child for just a moment, I felt like something sacred again. Not useful, not functional, sacred. I placed her gently in her crib and sat in the rocking chair Carla had found on Pinterest, but never used. The quiet was different now. Not sterile, not stifling, just still. My breathing slowed. My thoughts did not. That afternoon, after the baby had been fed, changed, and praised, Carla offered me a green smoothie and a quick chat. She mentioned, gently, that her mother was thinking of visiting for a few weeks, and they might need the guest room. Just temporarily, she said. It's not urgent. But maybe it's time we start thinking about next steps for you, Mum. Something more sustainable. I nodded. I even smiled. I thanked her for her honesty. Then I went upstairs and looked at my suitcase. I made a mental list. Clothes, pills, passport, cash. I knew what I'd take. I knew what I'd leave. The walls of the guest room didn't close in that night. They softened. They became porous. Temporary. I was no longer trapped inside them. I was only resting before departure. The next morning, I dialed the number from the sign. A woman answered. Sharp voice, short syllables, no warmth, but no nonsense. "You still renting the room?" I asked. Yes. No drama, no pets. Cash weekly, I said I could do that. She asked my age. I told her. She didn't flinch. She asked if I smoked. I said no. She asked if I was clean. I said obsessively. "Come see it tomorrow," she said. Afternoon. Don't be late, I wasn't. I didn't tell Carla. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell anyone. But the next day, I put on my best shoes, my coat that still smelled faintly of my old house, and I walked. The woman's name was Lorraine. She lived in a duplex that leaned slightly left, paint peeling around the gutters. wind chimes made of spoons clinking on the porch. She looked me up and down like she was weighing a bag of potatoes. Then she said, "You'll do." The room was small, a single bed, a window that stuck, a chair with a broken armrest. But it had a lock. It had silence. It had no tasks taped to the fridge. Lorraine asked for the first week's rent. I handed her the bills. She didn't count them, just nodded. "Move in when you want," she said. "Just text first." I hate surprises I left with the key in my pocket and a strange hollowness in my chest. Not sadness, not fear. Something else. Like space. Like possibility. That night, back in Daniel's house, I ate dinner with my back straight, my feet grounded, my voice calm. I smiled when necessary, offered no complaints. I cleaned nothing. Carla noticed. I could feel her eyes on me, weighing the shift. But she said nothing. Daniel talked about bonuses. The children argued over screen time. The baby babbled. And I sat in the middle of it all, already partly gone. That evening, I folded my clothes into my suitcase. Not all of them, just the ones that fit easily. I packed my toiletries, my pills, my folder of documents. I left the framed photo of Daniel's family on the bedside table untouched. I didn't need their faces. I needed air. I needed dignity. I needed the sound of wind chimes on a porch that had never known my name. I had almost convinced myself that this life had flattened me entirely, that the soft resolve I once carried had been worn down by lists, nods, and quiet obedience. When the final push came so slowly, I barely sensed it. It started in the late afternoon, with Daniel's voice at the bottom of the stairs, clipped and polite, asking if I could fetch the mail. The box was outside, by the road, and the light was changing, gold and brittle, as if the day itself were breaking under pressure. I walked down their neat sidewalk in the crisp air, the sort of Sunday air that smells of damp grass and exhaustion, carrying the empty mailbag they'd given me when I began these errands, an errand itself, designed to keep me busy, out of sight. I walked slowly, because my hip hurt and because the sky felt eager to break, and I thought of the woman I had once been, standing on a table to be heard, believing itself irreducible. But the sky cracked and I lowered myself, leaning hard on the porch rail as the mail tumbled and cards and bills slipped out, some fluttering with the breeze. I stooped to pick them up and found slips of paper behind the mailbox. Notices from the landlord, a canceled doctor's appointment, letters I didn't recognize. All things about rearranging my life. All things I would not act on because it was not yet time. I returned with the mail, parts of it clutched tight, other bits left crumpled in my bag. Carla glanced. Daniel glanced. No one asked if I was cold or needed help. The dinner was meatloaf and salad, lukewarm and reheated. I sat, hands folded, eating with quiet precision, feeling the hush morph once again into something heavier. The list on the fridge had grown, now including check mail, sort recycling, bake muffins for kids' lunchboxes. I simply removed it again, like erasing a wrong equation, and tucked it behind the fridge panel, safe until someone found it. That night, while the house hummed with ambient jazz, I lay awake and heard them whispering about me. I heard Carla's voice. "She's fading. I think she's losing herself." Then Daniel's, softer and uncertain. "Maybe she needs more structure." I wanted to cry. Not out of sorrow, but something darker. Rage for being so misunderstood, so contained. Rage at the silence they enforced, at the way they tendered kindness, as a warded-off kindness at the simple crime of existing. The next day, things seemed normal. The list reappeared, but this time it had a note. Optional tasks with a heart drawn in pastel marker. Beneath it, the usual bullet points, only fewer. A sneering mercy. I stared. I didn't fold it or trash it. I stared. Dinner was postponed for an hour because Carla had a meeting. I sat waiting at the table, alone. The place settings, silent witnesses. When the food arrived, I ate. But the weight of waiting settled like a stone in my chest. That evening, I withdrew the little blue salon card, unfolded it, and looked at it until the gradient of the logo blurred, until the words ceased to feel like manufactured comfort. I slipped it into the envelope with my essentials again, like a promise, like a talisman. 2 nights later, after a long day of silent chores and quiet avoidance, I returned home to find packed bags near the front door. Carla's, not mine. She was leaving for a weekend retreat with friends. She said she needed space, just to recharge, and offered that I might enjoy the quiet. I said nothing. I nodded. That night, the house breathed differently. The pressure softened. I ate cold soup in my room by the lamp's wavering glow, and for the first time in months, I didn't dream of leaving. I dreamed of space, of walking outside my name without bending. But the shift came like a flinch in mid-motion. Small, preternatural. It was a Tuesday morning. Carla had already gone. Daniel, brief, handed me a cup of coffee and said he had a surprise for me when he returned. I waited for that surprise. It never came. Instead, the children burst into my room in the afternoon, messy and sticky and unkind with truth. "Grammy, why do you wear the same cardigan every day?" they asked, voices thin with novelty. I looked at them, and at the sadness in the mirror behind them, one that had become habitual. I collected myself with a breath, smiled, softly said, "Because it makes me feel safe." And they shrugged and ran away, leaving behind the question, a moral weight that didn't belong to me. A few hours later, Daniel stood in the hallway, looking small as he spoke, voice low. "Carla thinks, she's worried about you." He paused as though waiting for me to finish. But finish what? I wanted to say I was fine. I wanted to eat and breathe in that order. I wanted my tools and my plans and my key in my hand. 2 nights later, there was an incident. A birthday party for Carla's friend. I was not invited, but I understood, subconsciously perhaps, that the absence was a question. Could I leave it unanswered? The hallway smelled of stale perfume and cake because they approached the guest room as a staging space for coats and charcuterie. I heard muffled conversation through the door. I stayed remote, and then footsteps came closer. It was a neighbor I'd met once, a polite nod in the morning. She knocked. "Are you okay?" she said, quiet. I looked at her, at the ear of the door framing her head. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. But I wasn't fine. I realized then that being asked at all dismantled the isolation they'd cast around me. In that moment, residency no longer felt natural. It felt like a performance I could walk out of. I walked into the living room that night, carrying a plate of untouched salad, and placed it softly on the table, where glasses and napkins and awkward conversations spun. They noticed. Daniel's boss raised an eyebrow. Carla smiled in question. I said, "I brought this up in case anyone is still hungry." No apology, no explanation. That small act of service, on my terms, felt heavy with quiet fury. And then I added, where the room could hear, I might leave soon. Not a threat. Not a plea. A statement. Silence fell. It was fuller than air. The party paused. The music stopped. Carla gave a tight nod, forced a smile. Okay, she said. We understand. And I walked away. Not to my room, but downstairs, to the door I hadn't unlocked before, the one that led outside. I paused, hand on the knob, and felt the pull of possibility again. I stepped through. Rain greeted me. The street was glowing, slick with promise. I didn't look back. That was the moment. Not the list, the nod, the request to wash the floors, but the resolve that angered them more than rebellion ever could. When I crossed the threshold, I reclaimed the ability to choose where and how to belong, and in that, found a kind of peace they never could give, and that no list could ever take away. I woke up early the morning I left, earlier than usual, not because I had trouble sleeping, though I did, but because the air inside the house felt different, more like a station than a home, like somewhere people paused before continuing on. The sky outside was gray with that pale kind of light that makes everything look like it's waiting. I didn't speak to anyone. I moved quietly, efficiently, the way I used to when Daniel was a baby, and I had only minutes before someone cried or spilled or needed me. But this time, there were no needs to meet. Only a decision to carry out. The suitcase had been packed for days now, small and precise, with only what I truly needed. My papers, my cash, the clothes that didn't shame me. I wore my navy blouse again, the one Carla said was too dated, and my slacks with the pocket sewn by hand, and I pinned my hair back not for them, but for myself, because I wanted to leave looking like the woman I remembered. I checked the room once more, not because I was sentimental, but because I didn't want to leave behind any trace they could twist into a reason to pity me. The guest room was clean, almost sterile. I left no note, no token. I didn't want anything interpreted or softened. Let the silence speak for itself. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty. Carla's green smoothie cup sat in the sink, already beginning to stain. I didn't wash it. I placed my mug from yesterday beside it, a quiet rebellion. I took one last look at the fridge, where a new list had appeared. Fall Refresh Week. And I smiled, just slightly. I opened the front door without hesitation, without turning around, and stepped into the morning that didn't belong to anyone yet. The cab was waiting, just like I'd arranged. The driver asked where we were headed. I gave the address Lorraine had written down, and we drove in silence, past the manicured hedges, the tidy playgrounds, the real estate signs with gleaming smiles, until the houses grew older and the streets narrower, until I felt like I could breathe again. When I arrived at Lorraine's, she met me at the door in her robe, hair wild, coffee in hand. She nodded once, pointed at the room. It's yours. Rent's due Friday. You get your own shelf in the fridge. Don't touch my fan. That was it. No welcome, no performance. I stepped inside and placed my suitcase beside the narrow bed, and something inside me settled. Not joy, not relief, but something steadier. A kind of earned stillness. I sat down, then stood again, unsure what to do with the sudden space. I opened the window, even though it stuck. I looked out at the uneven yard, the old chair under the tree, the clothesline swaying without rhythm. It wasn't beautiful. But it wasn't curated, and it was mine, for as long as I wanted it. That afternoon, I walked to the corner shop and bought a small notebook, a pen, a bar of soap that smelled like mint, and a packet of ginger biscuits. No one commented on my cardigan. No one asked what I was doing there. I paid in cash and walked home slowly. Home. Already the word felt different. Not like a place to impress or manage, but like a shelter from explanation. I placed the biscuits in my drawer. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the small desk beneath the window and opened the notebook. On the first page, I wrote a list. Not of chores, not of obligations. A list of things I remembered about myself. The first protest I joined, the poem I wrote in '87 that won a regional award, the way my mother once told me I had fire in the mouth. I wrote until the sun moved. I wrote until my hand ached. I wrote until the part of me they'd buried under politeness began to pulse again. That evening, as the light dimmed and the houses around me flickered to life, I stood in the middle of the room and took the cardigan I'd worn since winter and placed it in a bag for donation. Not out of shame, but because it had done its work. It had protected me. But I didn't need protection anymore. I needed air and paper and my own name said in my own voice. And then, without ceremony, I did what I had promised myself months ago. I stood on the table. Not theirs, not the sleek wood stained to match their expectations. Mine. The small table under the window with a cracked leg and 3 coffee rings etched like memory into its surface. I stood slowly, with care, balancing on the edge, my knees steady, my back straight, my arms by my side. I stood and looked out into the street. No one saw me. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had made myself tall again, even if only for myself, especially for myself. And I whispered, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the full clarity of a woman who had once been silenced in her own house. I am not your helper. I am not your project. I am not your quiet. And I stepped down, not because I had to, but because I was ready to walk forward. It's been 7 weeks now. 7 weeks since I carried my life in a single suitcase and walked out without asking anyone's permission, without apologizing for the space I needed. I count them not because I miss what I left behind, but because each week feels like a mile of land reclaimed after years of erosion. I've learned the rhythm of this new place. Lorraine's dry humor, the creak in the hallway floorboards, the way the sunlight hits the window at exactly 9:10 each morning. I've rearranged the small room twice, not because it matters to anyone but me, but because it reminds me I can. The desk now faces the window, and I keep the notebook open at all times, as if writing were a conversation I had abandoned for too long. I no longer wait for permission to speak. I no longer hesitate before asking questions in shops. I use my voice the way I used to when I was a young woman with something to prove, not loudly, but with the knowledge that it matters. I've rejoined the local library. I attend a Thursday morning discussion group, mostly women, mostly older, mostly like me, women who've survived dismissal, who know the language of being managed, handled, overlooked. We speak softly, but not passively. There's nothing passive about surviving silence and choosing not to return to it. Daniel has called 4 times. I answered once. He asked where I was. I said safe. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. He sounded tired, older than I remembered, but not enough to change what mattered. I told him I would let him know when I was ready. I haven't been ready. I don't know if I ever will be, but that's no longer the point. Carla hasn't reached out. Not once. I think she's angry, maybe confused, maybe afraid that without someone to quietly hold the house together, it might begin to creak at the corners. Or maybe she doesn't think of me at all, which is something I've learned to live with. Their silence is no longer my burden. I've started wearing color again, not to be noticed, not to be stylish, but because I remembered I like green, deep forest green, like moss and pine, and the bottle of ink my grandfather once gave me when I was 11 and thought I might become a writer. I wear green and I walk slowly, and I smile at strangers without fearing I'll be mistaken for needy. I've stopped shrinking in doorways. I've stopped waiting to be asked. I go to the park on Tuesdays and feed the birds even when they don't come close, because I like the act of offering, not the reward. I've begun cooking for myself again, real food, seasoned boldly, meals I don't have to justify. I eat when I'm hungry, not when someone else is ready. I sleep deeply. I dream again. Not of escape, of things I might still do. I don't tell these women in the library group everything. Not yet, but I watch them as they speak, and I see how they unfold, piece by piece. Stories that were once folded into corners of silence, now spilling out like loose thread. There's power in that. Not in the drama of it, but in the return, the quiet reclamation, the simple act of saying, "This happened. I was there. It mattered." One of them, a woman named Joyce, said something last week I've carried with me like a stone in the pocket. She said, "The worst thing they do to us is convince us we imagined it." And I nodded so hard it hurt. Because I had been doing that for months, questioning the severity of what I'd lived through, wondering if perhaps I had been too sensitive, too rigid, too proud. But I wasn't. I was just awake and alone and tired of being erased one polite request at a time. Some nights, I still dream of their house. But it isn't a nightmare. It's a quiet hallway, and I am standing at the far end, holding the same cloth I once used to wipe the floor. But instead of kneeling, I drop it, and I walk down the hall barefoot, leaving prints they can't scrub away. I don't knock. I don't ask. I open the door and leave it wide behind me. And when I wake, the feeling lingers. Not regret, not sorrow. Just clean air. I'm not angry anymore. That's the strangest part. The anger was useful. It got me out. It reminded me of the woman I had been before they decided what I was allowed to be. But it burned hot and fast, and now there is only clarity. I see them as they are, not villains, not monsters. Just people who built a world that worked for them and expected me to make myself smaller to fit inside it. And when I didn't, they called it ungrateful. I don't need revenge. I don't need forgiveness. I need this chair by the window. I need this pen in my hand. I need the space to become myself again in peace. If you're reading this, if you've found yourself cleaning floors while someone else calls it help, if you've been thanked with a smile that erases you, if you've heard the word grace used like a leash, know this: it doesn't have to end with silence. You are not a guest in your own life. You don't need permission to leave the room. You can stand on the table or walk away or open a window no one else notices. You can say no, and you can begin again, quietly, fiercely, fully.